Well, thank you all for attending, and especially at this time of the night and so forth. And what I'd like to do is, in a way, just give you a kind of an introduction to what the issue is about and why it arises, in particular in the United States, and has so much sort of sound and fury attached to it. And also, I want to say a little bit about what might be the prognosis for it in this country, since as was just said, that it looks like that there are quite a few people in this country who are at least interested in the idea. The first thing you have to understand about this kind of issue is that in the United States there's a formal separation of church and state that's mandated by the Constitution. And that is to say that the government and all of its agencies cannot in any way be used to promote a particular religious belief. Now, this is a feature of the country that is deliberately designed in opposition to what the settlers left in Great Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries. Okay, the people who settled America, especially the original colonies in the North, in particular, were religious dissenters. They were not members of the Church of England. They were Baptist, Methodist, people of that kind, Presbyterians, Catholics, and Jews. These people were typically middle class, reasonably wealthy people, well-educated people, but people who were not allowed to attend Oxford and Cambridge, were not allowed to serve in political office, and so forth. And so they were going to start a new land where there wasn't going to be this kind of religious restriction anymore. And the way they were going to make sure that that restriction didn't get reintroduced was by having this formal separation of church and state. And this has, in a sense, set a benchmark for democratic republics throughout the world that were created after the United States was created in the late 18th century. Now, the question is, how exactly does one interpret the separation of church and state? This matter becomes quite tricky because, in addition, in the United States Constitution, education is devolved to state and local authorities. So there is no Ministry of Education in the United States that would actually set something like a national curriculum that, in a sense, could resolve all these sorts of problems for everyone once and for all. Rather, the idea is that each state, even local community can set its own curriculum. States can set, as it were, curricular guidelines that need to be met, but the way they get met, can in fact vary quite a lot from district to district. And these local school boards, like the one in Dover, Pennsylvania, where I testified as an expert witness in the first major test of the intelligent design issue, composed of teachers and parents, and they basically have to agree amongst themselves on what's being taught in the classroom, especially in terms of what textbooks get selected. Okay, and then what can happen? And then these textbooks and the teaching practices have to meet certain state standards. But if they meet those state standards, anything else that's included in them is okay in principle. That is to say, unless, of course, a lawsuit gets raised. Okay, and this is what happened in the particular case that involved intelligent design, because what the case involved was a biology course which was already teaching evolution. So this is the other thing too. This is not a case in which evolution was to be excluded, but rather it was a case in which the idea was to introduce, not even necessarily discuss fully, but simply introduce this alternative idea of intelligent design. And it was this move that brought about the lawsuit, because the lawsuit basically claimed that what was happening here by trying to introduce this sort of alternative perspective, one was smuggling in religion, and that in particular the people who were promoting this in the school council were in fact religious fundamentalists, and it was quite clear there was a connection there. Now, immediately, at one level, this looks like a very kind of local issue where basically if you just sort of take the Constitution sort of straight and you look at the motivations of the local school board, you could say, yes, indeed, this is religiously motivated, it should not be allowed, etc. However, what happened was that this very quickly got turned into a sort of bigger issue, namely whether the idea or theory of intelligent design is itself inherently religious, right? In the sense that and what that means from a legal standpoint is that it has no scientific content. See, one of the problems that we face, and it's certainly a problem that I faced when I was acting as an expert witness in this trial, is that in the American legal system, science and religion are treated as mutually exclusive terms. Okay, so that if you show something has religious motivation, right, then you have therefore shown it is not science. And I consider this deeply problematic. And in the deposition that I gave, I start off by actually questioning this assumption. But this is very much part of the way in which the legal system thinks about these matters in America. So that what starts off as a doctrine of the separation of church and state ends up getting elaborated into this idea that any form of knowledge that is religiously motivated is suspect. Okay? And I should add that religion is the only kind of motivation that can end up leading a form of knowledge or a body of thought to be considered suspect. So, for example, supposing you have racist motivation for doing research, which in fact a lot of biology has had, including Darwinian biology, that in itself will not disqualify it from being scientific, because racist motivation is considered to be compatible with science. Okay? But religious motivation is not considered compatible with science. So now I've written about this, and I think this is a situation where you really do see, as it were, the sort of the anchoring of this whole problem in the way in which the United States originated as a country. Because had the American settlers been, non-whites, right, who were escaping, racial persecution, right, then probably the Constitution, right, would be singling out, making sure that there is no racial motivation in any kind of form of knowledge that's being pursued. But it was religious issues that were the dominant ones. And so that has come down through the centuries to end up marking the way in which education is done. And so that's a very important kind of point. And it may be, that's one of the things that I think, for people in the United Kingdom and other countries that do not have separation of church and state as strongly ingrained in the political structure as the United States, that might be, a reason why, let's say, people in this country might be a little more open-minded and might be don't feel that they have to take such a hard stand against intelligent design, or that, that they can kind of keep both in their minds and all the rest of it. So that's a very important part of the backdrop to this discussion. And I have to say that when even when I was talking to the lawyers who I was the expert witness for, they were cautioning me against bringing this up. Because look, you say you're not going to get any mileage with the judge by saying that religion and science are not mutually exclusive, because that's just something that's assumed. And so that what you then have to argue is that in fact intelligent design is science, in the sense that it's not religion. And if you look at the testimony that was given during this trial to all of the expert witnesses that were there, they would all be asked a question: is intelligent design religion or science? And they'd have to say one or the other, and the people on our side would say it's science, and the people on the other side would say it's religion. Okay? And that's part of the game, as it were, that one is forced to play in this kind of matter, and it really ends up queering the pitch of how one's going to be evaluating this. Okay, so that's a very important point to keep in mind at the outset. Now, there's another issue that's involved here, and that has to do with the particular history. There are two things here. There's, as it were, the history of the idea of intelligent design and whatever roots it has in science, and that's kind of what I was appealing to in my testimony. But there's also the business of how intelligent design aligns itself with other political and cultural sort of interests in the United States, including creationism. And creationism, when I say creationism in this context, what I mean is the biblical six-day creation story as it were, acting as a kind of authorizing form of knowledge to explain the origins and maintenance of life on Earth. Okay, that's what I mean by creationism. Okay, now creationism comes in many flavors, and there are textbooks that, as it were, present geological evidence and biological evidence of various kinds, but the conceptual framework in which it's presented is that of Genesis. So in other words, what one does is showing those aspects of biology and geology that actually vindicates the story in Genesis, and the stuff that doesn't vindicate the story is just not talked about or discredited. Because at the end of the day, the Bible is used as the standard against which to judge the science. Now that's creationism. Okay? Intelligent design is not that theory. However, there are some cultural continuities, and not least of which occur at the level of textbooks. And in a sense, this is a battle about textbooks, because we wouldn't be having this trial if it wasn't that people were selecting textbooks and the school board decides that it's going to select a textbook that talks about intelligent design, and then you ask, well, who publishes such textbooks? And the people who publish such textbooks are the people who historically have published creationist textbooks. And this has something to do with what publishers perceive as the market for this. You see, and so there's all those kinds of issues as well. In fact, the particular textbook that was being considered in the Dover trial was one called Pandas and People, okay? And it was like in its 5th, 6th edition, whatever. And the earlier editions were pure creationist stuff. But then what they've done is they've sort of sophisticated themselves over time, bringing in different ideas and so forth. And they've actually laundered out all of the references to the Bible. And so now it's all about intelligent design. But, you know, in that kind of very weak way, right, that high school textbooks introduce anything. You know, so if you ever look at even how, you know, books that are pro-evolution talk about evolution in science textbooks, it's usually pretty weak as well, and not, and you know, and very general and not very extensive and so forth. Well, same thing here with intelligent design, maybe even more so. And so that immediately rings alarm bells, because it looks like, right, intelligent design is just this kind of sanitized version of creationism. Okay? And that's, as it were, the serious charge that, in a way, the defense never really met as far as the judge was concerned. And the fact that there is this continuity in the textbooks, because, see, intelligent design as a theory doesn't really have its own textbook tradition. It is really parasitic on the creationists basically moving into this. But that doesn't necessarily mean the people practicing intelligent design are themselves creationists. And the way you would make the distinction has a lot to do with the background of the people involved. So in terms of the major principles of intelligent design, you've got guys like Michael Behe, who's a biochemist trained at the University of Pennsylvania. You have William Dembski, who has degrees in mathematics and divinity and philosophy from University of Chicago. And these guys, who make no bones about, they are Christians, devout Christians in all this, but their whole mode of operating, their arguments, so if you read their books, you don't see any reference to the Bible at all. They are making arguments, as it were, in the coin of science. Now, this doesn't mean they're making valid arguments. This doesn't mean they're making arguments that cannot be criticized. But these arguments are criticized at the level of in science, in terms of evidence, in terms of reasoning, in terms of the kinds of things that we normally consider to be the coin of the realm of science. And so, you know, from my standpoint, this is a big move. This is a big shift. And that the fact that these guys are religiously motivated doesn't bother me at all, because the way in which they're presenting their arguments, the way in which they would have themselves be judged, is scientifically, not religiously. Right? And what they're doing is they're presenting their religious beliefs, in a sense, as giving you a sense of the motivation they have, why it's plausible for them, as it were, to challenge the established authority, because it is, I mean, nobody is going to deny that the neo-Darwinian synthesis has a kind of intellectual monopoly in biology. Nobody denies that. And nobody denies that, in fact, it actually is entitled to that, given that it is really the only theory that can really explain the wide range of phenomena of life nowadays. It really is the only one. But to a large extent, it's really the only one around to do it. There are no active competitors being promoted. Okay, so as long as it's the only one, it's bound to look good. And this raises an issue about, you know, how science should be constructed as an enterprise, whether it's healthy for science to actually have one dominant theory, no matter how powerful it is, you know, have this kind of monopoly. So that in a sense, you're not allowed to be practicing biology unless you're already committed to the neo-Darwinian worldview. Now, it really hasn't gotten to that yet, officially, but one of the things that I found personally disturbing is that in the United States, we have this thing called the National Academy of Sciences. The National Academy of Sciences is a bit like the Royal Society, except that it was instituted by Abraham Lincoln as an advisory council to the president. So in that sense, it has much more of a political function than the Royal Society does, which, of course, originated as an independent, autonomous body. Now, the National Academy of Sciences in the late 1990s, when they started seeing intelligent design bubbling up for the first time under that name, published a statement which was quite remarkable, defining science. Now see, defining science is something philosophers do and other people like that, but scientists themselves usually think they do science well enough, they don't need to define it to anybody. They just sort of produce the stuff and it's science. But here there was an attempt to give a definition, and whenever somebody gives a definition of something, that's usually because they want to keep somebody out, right? As where they want to say, these are the criteria. If you don't meet this, you're not doing science. And so the idea was that you're not doing science unless you're committed to what's called methodological naturalism. Now, methodological naturalism basically means, well, it's a combination of things from a philosophical standpoint. It's obviously supposed to be telling you about how you do science, which is what methodology is about. But it basically isn't just doing that. It's also saying that you have to be committed to a certain way of seeing the world in order to be officially doing science. And it has to be one where the kinds of entities that you refer to are ones that can already be ordinarily considered part of the natural world. Okay, so in other words, it really restricts the extent to which you can bring in kind of entities that, in a way, behave rather peculiarly from a natural standpoint. Now, I found, as someone who knows something about I have a PhD in history and philosophy of science, I found this an incredibly strange thing to do. Not because methodological naturalism is a bad doctrine, but in fact, it is too limiting. That in fact, people who have done successful science have not operated within those constraints. And so, one person who comes to mind very clearly is Isaac Newton. And in fact, for me, and this is one of the things that I said in the trial, if you want to sort of see the kind of scientific power that you can have from adopting a kind of intelligent design standpoint, the person whose science you would look at is Isaac Newton. Because Isaac Newton really thought he got into the mind of God. And that was his idea, right? I mean, this was a guy, and this is what made his views and a lot of the views of the people of the scientific revolution so radical. I mean, those of you who know something about the scientific revolution of the 17th century know that this is a period where you start to introduce a conception of nature as mechanism, as machine. And if you know something about the intelligent design movement as it is today, people like Michael Behe, they talk about cells, by analogy with mousetraps, right? And that the type of design that one talks about in a cell, you try to understand it in terms of artifacts. Just like we make a mousetrap and it has this kind of natural wholeness to it, well, this is what Behe wants to say God's doing when he's designing a cell. That's sort of, to put the argument crudely, okay? But the point is, the conception that you've got, right, is that the way in which God operates in the world is accessible to human beings because the kinds of things that God does is kind of a big version of what humans do when they're creating artifacts and machines. So God is not this kind of nebulous spirit, right? God's not this kind of mysterious thing whose actions are, in a sense, in principle, unfathomable to us because they're somehow qualitatively different from us. No, what God is doing something quantitatively larger than us, but basically the same kind of thing. And so that, Sir Isaac Newton thinks, well, God, God's kind of a mechanic. If I were a mechanic and I were designing this universe, how would I do it? Right? And you'd want to do it in terms of the simplest principles possible, and Newton tried to figure out what those might be, and then he would then deduce all the consequences, which then would enable you to see how the universe would kind of play itself out, as it were, from those initial principles. Kind of like when you do a computer program, right? And you put in the initial rules, and then you sort of play it out, and you see kind of the universe that results from it. That's kind of the way in which Newton thought about things, okay? And this is to operate from the design standpoint, because you're operating from the standpoint of the person who actually made the thing happen. And that was what the scientific revolution was about. Now, this was really radical because, of course, if you are a very religious person, right, you're going to believe God is absolutely different from you and that there's no sense, the whole idea of getting into the mind of God is complete heresy. And so all these guys in the scientific revolution were always theologically dubious characters, okay? But that's the design standpoint. So God is a big mechanic. Okay, that's a very powerful view. It's been a very powerful view. And in fact, you see this view still operating whenever, look at what we do in genetics these days. Look at biotechnology, the playing God aspect of science. That's operating from a design standpoint as well. Okay, and what the intelligent design people do is basically really foreground that in a really big way, and in addition say, look, there's good reason for us to be adopting that standpoint as the standpoint from which to do science, because it's God's standpoint and we're made in the image and likeness of God. And that was historically the argument that was given, right? Basically, Sir Isaac Newton took the Bible very seriously, thought, well, you know, the Bible says human beings are privileged in nature, we're created in the image and likeness of God, which means if we can kind of do what God can do, well, God created the universe, well, maybe I can do it too. You know, I can do it my own small way by coming up with Principia Mathematica, which gives you the blueprint, gives you the plan. Okay, I mean, that's so, historically, this seems to me to be a very powerful idea. And you know, and I'm not just making this up. If you actually go downstream into the 19th century, when you start to get historians and philosophers reflecting, you know, because by the 19th century, we already have quite a lot of science on the table, right? Where you could, you know, the Victorian era, people are beginning to perceive there's progress taking place. And people are reflecting on, well, what is it that has enabled us to do this? So you get this guy who was the master of Trinity College, Cambridge, in the middle of the 19th century, William Whewell, who was both a natural theologian and a geologist, and is now known as sort of the founder of the field philosophy of science. He's also the guy who coins the word scientist as the name of a profession, and he's one of the people who was very active in the early days of the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Okay? And one of the terms that he coined that is very relevant here is heuristic. Okay? And heuristic is the sort of thing that we associate with problem solving, basically strategies for problem solving. And this usually has to do with what kind of a mindset do you have to be in? How do you have to conceptualize phenomena, frame it, as it were, in order to be able to turn it into a problem you can solve? And what Whewell writes, being very impressed by Newton, thinking, look, the whole idea of operating from the design standpoint, as we're trying to reverse engineer creation, is incredibly powerful. And in fact, that's been the thing that's been responsible for the scientific revolution that we have had over, you know, by the time Whewell's writing, already 200 years. And so what you see a lot in the 19th century is a lot of people talking about science in terms of model making, model building, creating small universes that are microcosms of the big universes, where human beings, in a sense, adopt the standpoint of mini-gods. Okay? And this turns out to be incredibly powerful. It doesn't solve every problem, doesn't solve every problem by any means. Right? The 20th century, in a way, has been devoted very much to showing the shortcomings of mechanistic thinking, but it is very powerful in its day and gets us very far into things. Okay? And in fact, this becomes quite important even for Darwinism, because Charles Darwin is not a mechanistic thinker. I mean, I think that's the first point. He's not a mechanistic thinker. I mean, he is looking at nature not from the standpoint of the creator, as it were, how did the creator lay it all out, but rather he's looking at it from the created standpoint. He's the recipient. He's kind of looking at nature as it's already out there displayed. Okay? So he's very much impressed by the variety, the diversity, right? So he's looking at it much more inductively, you might say, right? He's sort of their bottom-up kind of guy. He's not someone trying to get into God's mind. He's not, in that respect, Darwin's not an impious man at all, right? Very modest man in terms of his. But one of the problems as a result is that what's lacking in Darwin's theory, and it's one of the things that in fact ends up causing problems for Darwin's theory until, let's say, the second decade of the 20th century. Darwin's writing originally in the 1850s. It's only in the second decade of the 20th century that you actually get some serious mechanistic thinking into Darwinism. And what I'm talking about here is genetics. Because Darwin doesn't have a good theory of heredity. He doesn't have any theory of heredity. I mean, he's got a kind of mixed bag theory of heredity where he's kind of borrowing from different theories, but not very consistently. And so what he can't actually do is he can't actually kind of show, you know, at any kind of micro level how natural selection is working itself out. I mean, for Darwin, at the end of the day, natural selection is something that's proven by its results, by, as it were, the differences in survival among species in different environments and so forth. But what Darwin doesn't do is he doesn't tell you exactly what's going on in the organisms or the populations that are enabling these differences to happen and to be reproduced over time. That he can't explain, because he doesn't really have a mechanistic way of thinking about nature. And this is where genetics comes in, because genetics, of course, does provide that kind of mechanistic infrastructure. And over the years, over the course of the 20th century, right, genetics has become kind of more and more the driving force of biology. It gets more and more mechanistic, you might say. okay? To the extent that nowadays, laboratory-based genetics research is driving out a lot of the more natural historical stuff that is more closely associated with the sort of Darwin's own way of doing science, okay? Now, I say all this because if you were to go to the early 20th century and to look at what people were thinking about Darwinism back then, when Darwin's book, Origin of the Species, let's say 50 years old, people thought it was a nice theory. But they thought it was quite speculative because he didn't have any kind of conception of mechanism. And that the people who were doing genetics at the time, in that period, didn't feel as though they needed evolution to go about their business, because the geneticists were interested in kind of, very much like Newton, interested in timeless laws, right? Timeless mechanisms that, as it were, are working themselves out in organisms generation after generation. And this whole idea of having to have a historical story that goes back 4 billion years and all the rest of it, that seemed to be kind of, irrelevancy to them. Okay? They didn't think they really needed to bother with that stuff. What you really needed to do is what was manipulable in the lab and what you could show reproducing in the lab. So the geneticists, as you may know, in the early days, right, they would induce mutations in fruit flies and stuff like that to see how they would reproduce. And if they could get them to reproduce as they predicted, well, then they thought, we got grip on something here. We don't need to know about 4 billion years of evolution or anything like this. Right? We can make something happen here. And that gave the geneticists a lot of confidence about what they could do potentially, okay? And what we call the neo-Darwinian synthesis is basically bringing the genetics view of life together with this older Darwinian natural historical view. And that's what we call so nowadays people who call themselves neo-Darwinists, could be ranging from any of the disciplines in the biological sciences, from people who study field organisms and archaeology to people who work primarily in labs and are doing biochemistry, genetics, whatever, right? And they all can sort of sing to the same hymn sheet of Darwin. And this is something that really didn't start to happen until the 1930s and 40s, okay? Because basically, the Darwin viewpoint wasn't really attuned to a kind of mechanistic way of looking at things. Now, of course, if you think about the history of genetics by itself, you constantly get this theme of playing God. And that what those geneticists are doing, playing God, creating new species, creating new organisms, and so forth. And again, that's very much a continuation of this kind of Newtonian way of looking at the world, where the way you do science is to get into the design standpoint, and that is to say you get into the mind of the creator. Okay? And so what I was testifying in and as you know, the father of genetics, Gregor Mendel, was a Catholic monk, okay? And he was not an evolutionist. He was somebody who basically, in coming up with his ratios, was basically trying to explain how organisms were programmed with a certain range of possibilities for reproduction that didn't change from generation to generation. Because see, if you were an evolutionist back in Darwin's day, your tendency was to think that over time genetic potential was changing as different organisms mated with each other, that there was a kind of blending notion of inheritance, that it wasn't the same potential from generation to generation, but rather the potential was constantly changing. Whereas with Mendel, you get this idea that every generation of an organism, by virtue of the kind of species it is, has a certain fixed ratio of possibilities. And that's, as it were, specially created. Okay? And that, so again, the theological motivation for that kind of design standpoint of playing God is there even in the 19th century. Okay? So this is quite important, and this is the kind of thing I said in my testimony, because I think when we talk about heuristics, that is to say powerful ways of addressing problems in science, taking the standpoint of the creator has in fact had very efficacious results. And that in fact the people who have typically been driven toward that perspective, at least until the last 50 years or so, have been people with strong religious interests, who in a sense were thinking about reverse engineering the divine plan. Now, many of these people have had very kind of exotic religious views, thinking that human beings could turn into God, merge with God, all kinds of things more traditional religious people might not like. But one cannot deny that they are kind of theological. Okay? And so from that standpoint, this is to explain to you why I found it so problematic that science and religion was being kept so far apart in the discussion here of intelligent design. Because historically, they are in fact quite close, okay? Okay, so it gives you sort of a sense. Now, in describing all this religious sensibility associated with the design perspective. One reason why the scientists don't, I mean, it's pretty clear why the scientists don't like it, namely because the assumption of God, first of all, is unnecessary and doesn't seem to do any work in terms of the kinds of problems that biological scientists are trying to do today. I mean, that's kind of the main argument. I think there's some truth to this argument. But what I want to emphasize here is the fact that intelligent design is also problematic from the religious standpoint, because if you are one of those fundamentalist, true six-day creationist type believers, what you don't believe is that you can get into the mind of God. Right? And as I said, people like Newton were regarded as very heretical people. So this intelligent design view, as it were, has enemies on both sides. And so sometimes people present intelligent design as somehow a way of smuggling in religion or smuggling in religious fundamentalism into the science curriculum. But it seems to me that if we actually articulate what's involved in intelligent design and we actually take it in the fullness of its historical significance, I think what you'd have to conclude is that it's basically a very heretical theological position that really challenges the beliefs of the fundamentalists, because it denies, it seems to me, any absolute distinction between human and divine intelligence. Because it basically it allows the possibility for the human to approximate, at least, the divine. And that if there is a divine intelligence, it is different in degree, not in kind. It seems to me, and that seems to me an incredibly challenging notion. Now, one person who's quite important to this issue that I raise here largely because of where we are. We're here in Birmingham, right? Joseph Priestley. Okay, Joseph Priestley, who is regarded, who's the person who first isolated oxygen experimentally in the late 18th century, but didn't recognize it as such. He called it dephlogisticated air. He was still operating with the kind of older chemistry, which was based on phlogiston, the fire element, and then was talking about its evacuation as being what we call oxygen. But he experimentally isolated this, okay? So he's a chemist, but he's more than that. He was also a natural philosopher, and he was also a preacher. And he lived here for a while, and he was a Unitarian. Now, Unitarianism is the branch, the part, you might say, or the heresy of Christianity that actually starts to suggest that there is a convergence of the human and the divine intellect. Okay? And Priestley was very explicit on this point in a way that Newton was not. Newton, when he died, people found out that he had all of these writings on the Bible, but he never published them because he figured he'd be persecuted for it. But Joseph Priestley was a quite different guy. Joseph Priestley was right out there, in the late 18th century, and he was making speeches, giving sermons, and he was basically, saying that Newton basically has got the outlines of the divine plan now, and we are getting close to the point where we'll be able to take over creation entirely. And he was a big advocate of revolutionary politics at the time, and in fact, his house got burned down here. And he had to move to the United States. He had to move to the United States, and he became fast friends with Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, all these enlightened guys. And he ended up he died in a little house in Pennsylvania, about 50 miles from where this trial I was in took place. But the thing is, so when we talk about the time of the late 18th century, which is not just this time of the Enlightenment, but also revolutionary politics, this is all part of the mix, right? Where you start to get some religious people being very outspoken about the potential of the human converging on the divine intellect, taking Newton as not only setting a scientific but also theological precedent that in a way needs to be followed. And see, this then is used as a kind of clarion call for empowering people to take control of their lives, right? If this one man, Newton, can figure out what the divine plan is, all of you, being created in the image and likeness of God, can do that as well. And so Priestley was making sermons to that effect, inspiring revolutionary politics and causing a lot of trouble. Okay? So he was a very big supporter of the French Revolution. Right? And so this is kind of where a lot of this stuff, if you really kind of pursue it, and I think Joseph Priestley's life and the way he thought about the relationship between religion and science, I think really repays a lot of study today, because we really do live in a time where we sort of think of science and religion as these mutually exclusive and even antagonistic kinds of things. But if you actually go back to the Enlightenment, which we typically take to be the period where science really becomes a big kind of cultural bellwether, a lot of these guys were talking about the convergence of the two and the way in which this would lead to an empowerment of humanity, and it was very inspirational for a lot of democratic politics. Okay, precisely because the idea was, if this one man, Newton, can do this, then anyone can potentially. Okay? And so, and this would be a guy you would have to say was a believer in intelligent design. Okay, an intelligent design that human beings can fathom and take control over, and as a result take control of their fate. Okay? So this idea of intelligent design is not necessarily wedded to any kind of religious fundamentalist viewpoint that would get rid of science and kick it out of the classroom and have us read the Bible all day and brandish crosses at each other. This is not what we're talking about here. Right? We're talking about something that also historically has had very radical, revolutionary, and inspiring consequences that have promoted science. Okay? And in that respect, I think it's a very dangerous kind of doctrine, because the whole idea of the human and divine merging with each other, right, is something that people are very skittish about. But we are facing this kind of prospect today in the biotechnology realm. Right? In the aspects of biology that are led primarily by genetics, primarily by the mechanistic worldview, the branches of biology that in a way have the greatest independence from Darwinism, we are going back to this kind of idea, right, where we may in some sense, start to take on properties of the creator, of the designer. Okay? And it seems to me that this then faces us with a lot of questions. And I think that the idea of intelligent design in a way can kind of get us in the right frame of mind for it. Because we're no longer just going to be making references to nature as somehow controlling our fate, but rather we're going to be putting ourselves in a position of designers of our fate, of people who in a sense can sort of take control of nature, reverse engineer nature, and as a result have to be responsible for nature. Okay? Okay, I think I should stop here, but what I wanted to do here is basically to give you a sense of why I defended this particular viewpoint in the courtroom. I mean, as you may gather from what I've said, I think of myself very much as a person on the left and very much a person who's pro-science. Okay? But I do think that this viewpoint in a way has been sold short by being so closely associated with religious fundamentalists. One more thing I would say before closing is, if you want to do a sociology of what's going on here with intelligent design, the obvious place to look is the Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, which is the think tank that supports all this stuff. And you can go to their website and see all their things. Now, the person who founded the Discovery Institute is a guy by the name of George Gilder. Now, George Gilder began life as a liberal member of the Republican Party in the United States, and he was a speechwriter for Nelson Rockefeller, who was liberal governor of New York, and whose politics, if we had to compare it in Britain, would be somebody like Kenneth Clark. Okay, so he started off sort of there. And then over the course of the 70s and 80s, he moved toward the right and was in fact one of the architects of Reaganomics, what we call Reagan, which is like Thatcher, supply side kind of economics in the 80s. But where he really made his reputation, and this is what made him the kind of money that enabled him to found the Discovery Institute, was he wrote a book called Microcosm, where he promoted this idea of quantum economics. And what he was arguing was that the future of the economy was in the miniaturization of products and processes. And so a lot of the sort of startup firms associated with what we now call nanotechnology, he basically recommended that people get into in the late 1980s and early 1990s, and made a killing on it early on, and that enabled him to start this thing. Now, in the recent past, what he's been doing is he's been very much promoting the idea that the idea basically that, well, let me put it in a way that doesn't sound too outrageous. The possibility of uploading consciousness into machines. So as it were, that what is distinctive about human beings, our consciousness, our intelligence, can be transferred into a form that's more durable and potentially more powerful, perhaps by being extended by various computational, nanotechnological things and so forth. So the idea of, as it were, turning the human into gods, perhaps, maybe that's what's going on. And so one of the people whose ideas he's been promoting, albeit somewhat critically, but nevertheless giving a lot of attention to, is this guy Ray Kurzweil, who's a sort of well, what to say? He's a computer scientist, and he's one of the pioneers in voice recognition technology. But he's also the author of this rather visionary work called The Age of Spiritual Machines, where basically he says that the essence of what we are as human beings that distinguish us from other animals will come to be fully realized in these souped-up computers in the future, basically. That's the thesis, okay? And the Discovery Institute takes a lot of interest in this. Now, it takes a lot of interest in this for a couple of reasons. One reason is, and this is not a trivial reason, there's a lot of money in this. See, at the end of the day, this is techno-capitalism. This is kind of what we're talking about. And there isn't a lot of money in religious fundamentalists who are, basically a lot of poor white trash, right, who don't really know very much and don't have a lot of money to spend. But this is different. This is different. This is a different thing. This is a thing where there could potentially be a lot of money, but also it provides a kind of philosophical continuity with this older conception of intelligent design, where we're talking about the convergence of the human and the divine intellect. Because that is kind of the name of the game, it seems to me, with these guys. And they're sort of pursuing this angle. And so I recently was reading a book that was a symposium around Kurzweil's work that the Discovery Institute published, which had some of the main intelligent design people involved, where they're basically going back and forth on the degree to which some souped-up version of computers could, in fact, embody the spiritual qualities that we normally think, at least in the monotheistic tradition, as distinguishing humans from other animals. You see? And that's where I think these guys are going ultimately. And that's why intelligent, the scientific basis of intelligent design isn't just window dressing for a kind of biblical fundamentalism, but rather it's something that's sort of designed for this kind of super theological kind of conception of things, which they also think will bring in a lot of money for people who can cash in on it. Okay? And so if you wanted to say what the politics of these guys are, I would say they are politics of the right, but of that libertarian kind of capitalist right, not the right of family values and Bible reading and so forth. Not that right, but the other right, okay? And so I think I'll end there, because I think there's some things people might want to talk about. But see, that's kind of where I see this mapping out. And so this is really a much more scientifically motivated and sophisticated kind of view of things than has been so far presented in the media. And with that, thank you for listening. Well, yes, I think if you're looking at the particular claims that have been made by Behe and Dembski, who are kind of the front guys, the people who are most at the moment developing the ideas, that's right. Yes, and I do think, in my testimony in the trial, I tried to tiptoe around all that, because I do think that there have been some misfirings on the ID side. So, for example, one thing that came up was this business. Michael Behe says in his book, Darwin's Black Box, that evolution by natural selection cannot explain the bacterium flagellum. Okay? Now, the big mistake he made there was to say it cannot. Because, of course, then what happens is the evolutionists give you 12 possible explanations. They actually can't tell you which one is right, but they got 12 that you do research on. And I think the big mistake there was to say that evolution cannot. I mean, I think it would have been better if he said evolution, you don't need evolution. You can have an alternative mode of explanation that doesn't require evolution. That's the way he should have made the argument, namely that there is another way of doing it that doesn't presuppose evolution, rather than saying evolution can't do it. So there's a sense in which he pitched the argument wrong, and he ended up getting himself, I think, into an unnecessary conflict. Okay? Now, in the case of Dembski, William Dembski, who wrote this book, The Design Inference, what he's trying to do is to come up with some kind of mathematically precise notion of design that's not reducible to chance and necessity. Okay? Now, this kind of project actually does have some precedent. you know, because we do have these kinds of intuitions that there are things that are designed, but the question is, are there some common formal properties to them? And this is something you can get, for example, in information theory. You know, what is not redundant and what is not noise is meaningful, right? Is informative. And then that's actually a trichotomy that's recognized there as well. And Dembski is sort of drawing on that. But he's giving it a larger metaphysical significance. And what people there say is basically he hasn't made the argument yet. In other words, he hasn't come up with the right criteria to exclude chance and necessity. But I take this, you know, to be, first point I would say is, that's an argument in the realm of science, as it were. You know, in other words, it doesn't require the Bible. It doesn't require theology. People are making, you know, he's making his argument in scientific terms, and they're responding to it in scientific terms. And what I say is, go back to the drawing board and make better arguments. Okay? You know, I mean, which is kind of what you should be doing. So you know, but what that does is it shows that this whole thing is happening in the realm of science and not religion. And it seems to me that's a very important part of this issue. Because it's one thing to say that their science isn't quite right. It's another thing to say that it's religion. And I think those two things need to be separated. And I do think that these arguments are being conducted in the coin of science, but they may not be being conducted very effectively. But here I do think, and I made this point in the court, part of the problem is there aren't enough of these guys working on it. There are very few people working on this stuff now. Very few people are motivated to work on it because of the religious aura surrounding it. Okay? And of course, a lot of people will never have looked at any of this material before dismissing it. I'm very struck by this myself. I recently was looking at a paper by a philosophical colleague, very distinguished philosopher in the United States. And he asked me what I thought about this because he was going to publish this in a major journal. And the arguments themselves look kind of okay, but I was very curious about what the man's sources were for intelligent design. What was he relying on as his sources of information for what intelligent design was? And it was all newspaper articles. None of the reading of the original texts, which I thought was quite amazing, especially for that kind of academic work. But that's very common, actually, that in a sense, people's impression of what intelligent design is very much colored by the way it's been reported in the media. And so I think there is a tendency to think that this stuff, as it were, has its religion much more upfront than it really does. You know, I mean, you know, because when somebody says, well, you know, the science is just window dressing, well, it's damn good window dressing, because in a sense you could deal exclusively with the window dressing and still have a lot of content. And that's what I would say to people. Look at this stuff. You know, look at it, you know, in its own terms.
But it's interesting when you say that one of them said you can't explain this in terms of evolution, because you then actually got the opposite happening as well. So on the ID side, I think the ID side, you're picking up things like the bombardier beetle.
Yeah.
And they're saying, here, look, you know, you got this, and this. How can this possibly evolve? So they're actually saying, we don't believe this can evolve. It had to be designed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is almost the complete opposite.
Yeah.
The other side.
Yeah. No, I think that there is some real serious kind of misfiring in the arguments here. But again, I think if there were more people working on this, because typically, there's nothing wrong, and this has a lot to do with one's conception of science. I believe that it's really quite important for science that you have groups of people operating with rather different metaphysical assumptions, you know, about what the primary source of explanation is, conducting their research and sort of, in a sense, assuming at the outset that the other side can't do it, but nevertheless come up with your own positive results, with your own assumptions. And I think that ID ought to have a chance to do that. The problem is that in the current scientific climate, it's not at all clear how the space will ever be made for this, right? I mean, because one thing that came out in the trial, for example, was that Behe published an article in Protein Sciences Journal where he showed, basically it was a computer simulation model sort of showing how a certain kind of complex protein, it was very unlikely to have been able to evolve in the amount of time given by natural selection, which is a kind of common sort of argument that these intelligent design guys like to run. And the journal accepted the article, but one of the conditions of publication was that he had to remove any kind of references to intelligent design or irreducible complexity or any of those kind of terms because they weren't allowed as scientific. So in other words, the conceptual framework that motivated him to come up with this simulation that ended up making this point, right, was disallowed. Okay? So, this makes it very difficult then for people who are doing research inspired by this approach to actually have the approach, as it were, be credited for the things it does come up with. Okay? I'm not saying it's come up with a million things, and I'm not saying there's millions of guys being censored out there, because there aren't millions of people doing this. But the few who are doing it seem to be subject to a lot of resistance. Whereas, on the other hand, one of the things that came up in the trial was one guy presented a computer simulation program which was basically a program for generating computer viruses, but was presented as a kind of model of natural selection. Okay, maybe, who knows? But the interesting, and this appeared, I think, in Science or Nature, one of the really kind of, main journals. And I read this article because I was very interested to see exactly what was passing for natural selection, because natural selection is a movable feast in a way, and it's not like Newton's laws that's very clearly pinned downable. And so I was thinking, well, what's passing for natural selection in this article? And what you're treated to in this article, the first 4 paragraphs, is basically what I would call a metaphysical exhortation about how natural selection can explain everything, where you're getting citations to people like Daniel Dennett, the philosopher. Right? So in other words, there's no science, there's no, conceptual framework that actually motivates the problems being solved, but rather, a kind of, a philosophical endorsement of a general view that then you start talking about the research itself. So you're getting a lot of, as it were, a lot of free airplay for Darwinism before you even talk about the research. You see, and I think if you're good, I have no problem with people being very explicit about their philosophical, metaphysical assumptions in science. So I don't want to begrudge the fact that Nature and Science published a piece the way it did. But then if you're getting other scientific journals excluding other frameworks, this seems to be very unfair. Okay? And this came out in the trial. And I think this represents a kind of problem in terms of ID, getting likelihood of its getting legitimacy. Mm-hmm.
Can it be falsified, ID?
Yeah, but Popper didn't think evolution could be falsified, right? Well, but see, look, but the issue here is even things that, as someone who, I myself have written a little book on Popper, and I like Popper. But I think one of the things that Popper was very careful about was that the function of metaphysics, right, is to inspire research. So Popper was an anti-metaphysics in a sense. He just said, metaphysics, as it were, has its place, in that heuristic mode that I was talking about earlier, namely in terms of giving you a certain kind of mindset for setting problems. But what needs to be falsifiable are, as it were, hypotheses and theories at a kind of lower level. So just like you can't say can you have a direct test of evolution by natural selection? No, not a direct test, but you can maybe have an indirect test, right, if you operationalize natural selection in a specific kind of way, in a specific kind of context. And that's what, in fact, biologists do. But intelligent design hasn't done that yet. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a fair criteria. But you can't really have testable hypotheses until the theory has been sufficiently articulated that you can, as it were, connect up the largest kind of metaphysical assumptions with things happening closer to the empirical level. And see, and it took a long time actually for Darwinism to do that. And this is where genetics plays a very important role, because before genetics gets incorporated in the neo-Darwinian synthesis, what is Darwinism about? It's mostly about history. Right? And this is why Popper thought it was unfalsifiable.
That's right. I mean, my other question really was intelligent design. Now, what is regarded as being, who is the intelligent? Where is the intelligence? Is it something outside the natural world which is coming in and
designing it, yeah.
Designing it, or is it just natural selection which produces these wonderful...
Well, okay. Right. Well, first of all, let me say as a background point that in a sense, intelligent design is not meant to be a direct competitor with Darwinism in the sense of providing an alternative theory of life. It is primarily a theory of design, okay, where design is a larger category. So what is designed? Well, artifacts are designed, technology is designed, and we know who designed them, human beings, and we can explain how that happens. We're the intelligent designers there. And then there are organisms, which according to this way of looking at things, are also designed in exactly the same sense, but not by human beings in the first instance, but perhaps by God, God knows who. I don't know. I mean, but the point is, that's kind of it seems to me that's the conceptual framework that one has to think about, namely that we already have a model of the intelligent designer, namely humans. We already know that humans intelligently design things because they design artifacts and so forth. And of course, humans now are even able to do biotechnology, so we can design stuff even at the organic level, right? And so the idea is going to be that as it were, the ultimate intelligent designer who actually designed life in the first place will be an intelligent designer in something like that sense. And so this is where the idea of the kind of intellectual similarity between God and humans becomes salient.
Yes, I mean, are they supposing that the intelligent designer started the whole process off and just let it go?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Or are they, sort of miracles occurring?
No, I see. My view is that intelligent design should be an anti-miracle view. Okay, and that the temptation to go for miracles is, of course, because then you can live with a kind of accommodation with evolutionary theory. Namely, evolutionary theory kind of explains everything except these moments of radical ruptures, the so-called macroevolution, in which case God has to be zapping something in to make the qualitative changes from plants to animals, animals to humans, and so forth. I think that's a bit of a dodge there. It seems to me that shouldn't be your perspective. I mean, it seems to me that you really should take the design notion, because that's what Newton did. Newton took the design notion quite seriously, right? And that's why, he was very deterministic in his laws and everything like that, and that God really laid it all out. And I think, that's the pure intelligent design position, not one where God is just zapping miracles whenever things can't be explained by our normal science. That's right. That's right.
So there's no forethought, there's no crystal game.
No, that's right. That's exactly right. No.
But the intelligent designer would not think that. He would see the notion of a designer as somebody who has a blueprint and then builds according to that blueprint.
Well, okay. Here's someone to look at in this respect, because there is a kind of an accommodationist position here, and it's the guy Charles Babbage. Some of you may know Charles Babbage as the inventor of the computer, the analytical engine in the 1830s. Okay, well, he was one of the successors to Newton's chair at Cambridge. And, in talking about the idea of the programmable computer, the context in which he introduced that idea was as a design argument. Because one of the things that Newton didn't have, which Babbage had, was probability theory. And Babbage was very concerned about the fact that, in Newton's universe, it wasn't clear how free will was going to be built into it, right? Because Newton's laws are deterministic laws, and so human beings have free will, and free will isn't just some kind of epiphenomena illusion, but it's kind of what makes us kind of like God, is the fact that we have a certain kind of initiating powers, right? And so how are you going to capture that in terms of some sort of design? Well, what you have to imagine is the computer program, as it were, has some stochastic variables put in. As it were, God didn't just, God planned the universe with some variables that can be played out in ways you cannot anticipate until they actually play themselves out. And that was Babbage's notion of design, you see. And he thought that squared the freedom and determinism issue. And I think that's kind of where you'd want to go on that. That would be, to recover Charles Babbage as a design theorist.
Does anyone have any last quick questions? I'm just sort of aware of the time getting on. Is it a quickie or is it going to set off?
I think it's a quickie.
Mm-hmm.
You've got sort of 4 different kind of parties at the trial. So you've got the school board, you've got the parents who are against it, you've got the evolutionists, you've got the ideas. So can you just give us a quick flavour, if I can dare say, of arrogance? Do you find it in all 4, or none, or one in particular?
What are you asking? What am I?
Arrogance of approach to the trial. So in terms of the 4 groups of people there, do they all come across as arrogant? Does one of them?
Well, here's the problem, right? The local school board didn't have any idea what they got themselves into. Okay, I mean, these people were totally, They're nice people, totally clueless. I mean, they didn't. I mean, I think it is true what the facts of the case are, and in this sense, our side did deserve to lose in the following sense, okay? Namely that, look, the really religious fundamentalist guys didn't know anything about intelligent design. They didn't like Darwinism. They were looking for some way to kind of minimize the impact, because their science teachers were very Darwinist, okay? And so they went on the web, and the Discovery Institute, God bless them, have these enormous websites with all kinds of, you know, articles and things like this, and they say, ha! That's the ticket. We'll start supporting intelligent design. Looks like science to me. And that's kind of how they got into it, okay? They got into it that way, not because, you know, and then, right, the Discovery Institute and other people supporting intelligent design saw this as a kind of legal opportunity to get it into into the school system, because this is the first time intelligent design had been tested under that name, you see. And so they figure, well, if we can win this case, then of course we can then put out better books and be more sophisticated, but we need to sort of get in somehow, okay? And so they thought, you know, so then all the theorists and all the big money and all that started to get interested in this case. Now, when that happened, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is traditionally the great defender of Darwinism, they're the ones who funded the Scopes trial in defending John T. Scopes in 1925, right? They got in to support the parents in Pennsylvania, okay? So then it became this enormous media circus, okay? And the thing is, at the end of the day, the foundation for it at the local level was always very flimsy. Because these, you know, look, these people don't know anything about it. I mean, you know, the ACLU lawyers, in cross-examining the locals, asking them about the fine details of intelligent design, you know, about the bacteria.